Have you ever had that strange feeling that your name, your choices, or even your silence seems to travel further than you expected? Like you walk away from certain places, certain people, and somehow, the conversation about you doesn't end when you leave. Not in a dramatic way, not in a loud or obvious way, but in subtle shifts, in pauses when you enter a room, in the way people react differently to you over time without ever telling you why. And what makes it even more confusing is this: no one ever admits it directly. They act normal, they smile, they move on. But something in the background feels like you're part of conversations you were never invited into. Not because you're important in a loud, attention-seeking way, but because you leave impressions that people quietly process when you're not around. This isn't about paranoia. It's not about imagining things. It's about a very real human behavior pattern that most people experience at some point in their lives, especially when they start changing in ways others don't fully understand yet. And if you've been noticing this more often lately, there's a reason your awareness is picking it up now. When life starts feeling observed without explanation, there's a specific stage in personal growth where your awareness shifts before your environment catches up. You start thinking differently, speaking differently, reacting differently, and even though you're still the same person at your core, something about you feels unreadable to others. People don't always know how to categorize that. So instead they talk. Not always negatively, not always positively, but they talk because humans try to make sense of what they don't fully understand. And here's the interesting part: this isn't unique to you. It happens to anyone going through visible or invisible internal change. But when it happens to you, it can feel isolating. You might notice small moments. A conversation goes quiet when you approach. Someone brings up your name in a way that feels slightly rehearsed when you enter the room. You hear about discussions after the fact, never during. Again, none of this is supernatural. It's social psychology. People process change in others through discussion, especially when that change disrupts their expectations of who you used to be. And if you've grown recently, emotionally, mentally, or even just in how you carry yourself, you may have unintentionally created contrast. That contrast becomes noticeable, and noticeable things get discussed. Section 1. The silent shift in how people perceive you. One of the most overlooked truths about human relationships is that people don't update their perception of you instantly. They carry old versions of you in their mind. The version that was easier to predict, easier to understand, easier to place in a mental category. So when you change, even slightly, it creates a kind of cognitive lag. You're no longer matching the mental image they have of you. And instead of openly acknowledging that shift, most people do something subtle. They compare notes with others. They ask indirect questions. They observe you more carefully. They revisit past memories of you to recalibrate their understanding. This is where conversations about you quietly begin to form. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because inconsistency between expectation and reality naturally creates curiosity. And curiosity leads to discussion. For example, you might notice someone saying, "You've been different lately." But what they often don't say is everything they've already been thinking before they said that sentence. This gap between observation and expression is where most of the hidden conversations exist. It's not about you being the center of attention in a dramatic sense. It's about you becoming harder to mentally categorize. And humans don't like ambiguity for too long. So they talk. Section 2. Why your presence feels loaded to others. There are people who can enter a room and go unnoticed. And there are people whose presence subtly shifts the tone of the space, not because they demand attention, but because they carry a certain internal clarity that others pick up on unconsciously. If you've been going through personal change, especially emotional or psychological growth, your presence may start to feel different to others even before you say a word. Not louder, not more dominant, just more defined. And when someone becomes more internally defined, people around them often start reflecting that change back in their behavior. Some become more attentive. Some become more distant. Some become overly curious. And some start talking to others about you, not out of judgment, but out of an attempt to understand their own reaction. This is where perception gets complicated. Because you don't see those internal reactions directly, you only see fragments of it in behavior shifts. A friend who used to talk freely becomes more reserved. Someone who used to ignore you suddenly pays more attention. A group dynamic subtly changes when you join or leave. From your perspective, it feels like something is being discussed behind the surface. But from a psychological standpoint, what's really happening is processing. People are recalibrating how they relate to you based on who you're becoming, not just who you were. And that often happens socially, not privately. Section 3. The role of misunderstanding in modern connections. Misunderstanding is not always negative. In fact, it's one of the most common byproducts of growth. When you evolve internally faster than your environment can interpret you, gaps form in communication. And humans fill those gaps with stories, assumptions, and discussions with others. Not because they're trying to define you incorrectly, but because uncertainty creates discomfort. So instead of asking you directly, people often seek indirect validation through conversation. This can create the feeling that you are being talked about, when in reality, you are being interpreted. And interpretation spreads socially. One person shares an impression, another adds their perspective, a third tries to connect patterns. Before long, your presence exists in multiple narratives that you are not actively part of. This is a normal part of social life, especially in environments where people are emotionally invested in each other's behavior. But it can feel strange when you're the one being observed more than you're observing. The key insight here is this. Being discussed doesn't automatically mean being judged. Often, it just means being noticed in a way that doesn't yet have a clear definition. And undefined things tend to become conversation topics. Section 4. When you start noticing your own reflection in others. There's a turning point in self-awareness where you begin to realize something subtle. People don't just react to you, they reflect you. Not your physical appearance, but your emotional state, your confidence level, your internal stability. When you're uncertain, people may respond with uncertainty. When you're grounded, people may adjust their behavior around that stability. And when you change internally, you might start seeing inconsistent reactions from others because they are responding to different versions of you they remember or perceive in the moment. This can create the impression that you are being watched or analyzed. But what's really happening is feedback loops in human behavior. People are constantly updating their understanding of each other through interaction. And if your internal state has shifted recently, through life experience, reflection, or emotional maturity, those updates become more noticeable. You might find yourself thinking, why are people reacting to me differently than before? Or, why does it feel like I'm being evaluated even in casual moments? What's actually happening is that your behavior is no longer predictable in the same way it used to be. And unpredictability naturally leads to observation. Not in a conspiratorial sense, but in a deeply human one. People study what they don't fully understand yet. Section 5. Why silence often speaks louder than words. One of the most misunderstood parts of personal change is silence. Not the absence of sound, but the shift in how you respond to people, situations, and attention. There's a stage in growth where you stop explaining yourself as much, not out of arrogance, but because you begin to realize that most explanations don't actually land the way you hope they will. People don't always interpret your words as clearly as you intend. They interpret them through their own assumptions, moods, and past impressions of you. So over time, something subtle happens. You start conserving energy. You choose when to respond and when to stay quiet. You become more selective with your reactions. And that silence creates something interesting socially. It leaves space. And in that space, people start forming their own interpretations. Not because you're doing anything to provoke it, but because the human mind dislikes empty gaps in understanding. If you don't fill the gap with explanation, others will fill it with interpretation. And interpretation often turns into discussion. This is where many people begin to feel like they are being talked about more than before. But in reality, what has changed is not the amount of conversation about you, it's your reduction in visible self-explanation. When someone used to constantly clarify themselves, their image felt more stable to others. But when that person becomes more silent, more composed, more internal, their behavior becomes less predictable. And unpredictability creates mental processing in others. They replay past interactions. They compare recent behavior. They try to understand what changed. That processing doesn't always stay internal. Sometimes it spills into conversations with others who know you. Not because you are the subject of judgment, but because you've become a point of reflection. Silence in that sense is not empty. It's active in its own way. It forces people to think instead of simply receive. And thinking, especially in social environments, often turns into dialogue. Section 6. The disconnect between who you were and who you are becoming. There is a very specific type of discomfort that comes with growth. It's not dramatic. It doesn't always feel exciting. It often feels like a quiet disconnect between your internal evolution and your external environment. The people around you may still relate to a version of you that no longer fully represents who you are. And you may still find yourself reacting in ways that belong to an older version of your thinking. This overlap creates confusion on both sides. From your perspective, you might feel misunderstood or slightly out of sync. From their perspective, they might feel like they need to relearn how to understand you. And in that adjustment phase, conversations naturally emerge. People try to bridge the gap between old perception and current observation. They might ask questions indirectly. They might bring up past memories of you. They might compare your current behavior with how you used to be. This isn't always intentional analysis. It's often emotional adjustment. Because when someone changes in your life, especially someone you are familiar with, your brain tries to maintain continuity. It asks, is this still the same person I thought I knew? And while that question is being processed, discussions happen behind the scenes, not as a conspiracy, but as a natural attempt to make sense of change. The important insight here is that being talked about in this context is not about status. It's about adjustment. You are not being evaluated as much as you are being reprocessed mentally by people who are trying to update their understanding of you. And that updating process is rarely silent. It moves through conversation because humans are social processors. We think out loud when things don't fully fit. Section 7. When you start feeling seen in ways you can't fully explain. There comes a point where awareness becomes sharper than explanation. You start noticing patterns in how people react to you, even when nothing obvious is said. A shift in tone, a change in eye contact, a slight pause before responding. None of these things are dramatic on their own, but together they create a sense of heightened awareness. And that awareness can feel like you are being observed. But what you are actually experiencing is social sensitivity, increasing in response to your own internal development. When you become more self-aware, you also become more attuned to micro-changes in others. You notice things you previously ignored. And because of that, you begin to sense layers of interaction that were always there, but previously outside your attention. This can make it feel like something has changed externally. But often, what has changed is your ability to perceive it. At the same time, others may also be responding differently to you because your behavior has shifted in ways they can't easily define. So what emerges is a mutual awareness loop. You notice them noticing you. They notice you noticing them. And in that loop, interpretation becomes unavoidable. This is where the feeling of being in conversations you're not part of becomes stronger, not because there is hidden intent everywhere, but because social awareness has become more layered on both sides. It's a mirror effect. And mirrors don't explain themselves, they reflect. Section 8. Identity Shift and the Quiet Redefinition of RELATIONSHIPS. One of the most significant but least discussed parts of personal growth is how it quietly redefines relationships without formal announcements. No one sits down and declares that dynamics have changed. Instead, it happens through accumulation. Small shifts in behavior, changes in communication frequency, differences in emotional availability. Over time, these small shifts create a new version of relational reality. Some connections become quieter. Some become more distant. Some become unexpectedly stronger. And some feel slightly unfamiliar, even if nothing directly negative has happened. This is where many people start overanalyzing their social world. They wonder if something is wrong. But in many cases, nothing is wrong. It's just alignment changing. When you grow internally, your tolerance, your interests, your emotional boundaries, and your perception of connection all shift slightly. And not everyone grows in the same direction at the same pace. That difference creates natural spacing. In that spacing, people reflect on you more. They may talk about you in attempts to understand where you fit in their evolving mental map. Not because you are central to their lives in a dramatic sense, but because change in familiar people always triggers internal dialogue. And while this may feel like you are the center of conversation, what is actually happening is simpler. You are part of a transition in their understanding. And transitions are always mentally active. There is a strange stage in personal development where life doesn't feel louder, it feels more interpreted. You begin to sense that people are reacting to something you can't fully point to. But more often than not, what they are reacting to is not a secret version of you, or hidden narratives, or unseen attention. It is the visible effect of internal change that hasn't been fully named yet. And when something cannot be named easily, people talk about it. Not to define you, but to understand what they are experiencing in relation to you. That distinction matters, because it shifts the entire perspective from suspicion to understanding. You are not at the center of hidden attention. You are at the center of evolving perception. And perception is always in motion. If this reflection gave you something to think about, it might be worth sharing your perspective on a simple level. Not to confirm anything, but just to express how you've experienced changes in how people around you respond over time. Sometimes, those shared experiences reveal patterns that are more about human behavior than anything personal. And conversations like that are where deeper understanding often begins. Section 9. How memory shapes the version of you people hold on to. One of the most powerful forces in human perception is memory, not reality. Most people don't interact with you as a completely updated version of who you are today. They interact with a blend of who you were, what they last experienced, and what stood out emotionally in past moments. That means every interaction you've ever had with someone leaves behind a kind of emotional snapshot. And those snapshots don't automatically update just because time has passed. So even if you've changed internally, grown, or shifted your mindset, others may still be responding partially to an older version of you stored in their memory. This creates a subtle mismatch. You say something today, but it gets filtered through yesterday's impression of you. You act differently, but it gets compared to how you used to act in a different context. And in that comparison process, people naturally start thinking about you more when you're not present. Not in a dramatic way, but in a reflective one. They revisit past interactions. They question whether they understood you correctly. They compare old and new impressions. And that mental comparison often becomes conversation when shared with others. Not because there is anything unusual about you, but because memory itself is not static. It is constantly being reorganized. And whenever humans reorganize their understanding of someone, they often do it through discussion. Section 10. The social weight of change you don't announce. Change that is announced is easy for people to process. When someone says, "I'm working on myself," or "I've been going through changes," it gives others a framework to understand what they are seeing. But unspoken change is different. When you evolve without explaining it, people are left to interpret the difference on their own. And interpretation, by nature, varies from person to person. Some will see it as growth. Some will see it as distance. Some will simply notice something feels different but won't have the language to describe it. This lack of clarity creates a kind of social ripple effect. People compare notes. They mention your behavior in passing. They try to understand whether others are seeing the same thing they are seeing. And through that process, your presence becomes something that is quietly discussed, not because of importance but because of uncertainty. The human mind doesn't like unexplained shifts in familiar patterns, so it seeks validation through external conversation. This is especially true in close social circles, where people share overlapping experiences of you. What feels like being talked about is often just collective sense-making, a group trying to understand a version of you that hasn't been clearly labeled yet. Section 11. Why you start feeling mentally present even when you're not there. There's a specific psychological experience that happens when your presence leaves a strong impression on people's internal awareness. You're not physically there. You're not part of the conversation. But somehow, your name or your actions enter the discussion naturally. This doesn't mean you are constantly the focus of attention. It means your impact, in certain environments, has enough weight to remain in people's minds beyond the moment of interaction. And when something remains mentally active, it gets revisited. People recall things you said. They reinterpret things you did. They connect dots they didn't connect at the time. This is normal human cognition. The brain continues processing after experiences end. And when those internal reflections are shared with others, it creates the feeling that you are present in conversations you're not physically part of. But the key point here is not attention, it's processing. People are not fixated on you in a constant way. They are processing their understanding of you in intervals, just like they do with many people they encounter in life. The difference is that certain impressions linger longer than others, especially when someone's behavior doesn't fit a simple category. And anything that resists simple categorization tends to be mentally revisited. Section 12. The inner shift that changes how you interpret others. As your awareness grows, something subtle happens that you may not immediately notice. You begin to interpret others differently as well. Not in a judgmental way, but in a more observant, reflective way. You notice tone shifts more clearly. You pick up on pauses that you previously ignored. You become more aware of what is being said directly versus what is being implied indirectly. And because your perception sharpens, you also start sensing layers of social interaction that you didn't register before. This can sometimes create the impression that something is happening beneath the surface. But what's actually happening is that your perception is becoming more detailed. You are not seeing hidden realities. You are seeing more of the existing reality. And when perception becomes more detailed, social environments can feel more complex than they used to. This increased awareness can make you feel more visible in conversations, even when nothing has changed externally. Because once you become aware of subtle social patterns, you also become aware of how often humans discuss and interpret each other in everyday life. It's not unusual. It's simply part of how social cognition works. We are constantly forming impressions, updating them, and occasionally sharing them with others as part of understanding the world around us. Section 13. When personal growth starts feeling like distance. There is a quiet stage in growth where you realize something that is not often spoken about directly. Not everyone who knew you before will fully understand the direction you're moving in. And not everyone who understands you now will have known you before. This creates a natural spacing in relationships. Some connections remain stable. Some evolve with you. Some slowly shift into a different form of interaction without any clear breaking point. And in that transition, it's common to reflect on how people perceive you. You might notice that some interactions feel slightly more cautious. Others feel more curious. Some feel unchanged on the surface, but different underneath. This is not necessarily about judgment. It is about adjustment. People adjust to changes in others in real time, often without consciously realizing they are doing it. And during that adjustment phase, conversations about behavior, personality, or what's changed tend to appear naturally. Not because you are the subject of scrutiny, but because human beings rely on dialogue to stabilize their understanding of each other. What feels like being observed is often just the echo of adaptation. At some point, the most important shift is no longer about how people see you, but how clearly you see your own life without needing constant interpretation from others. Because when you step back from trying to decode every reaction, every silence, every conversation you're not part of, something stabilizes inside you. You start realizing that people will always form impressions, update opinions, and process experiences in their own way. That part of human nature doesn't stop. But your peace doesn't have to depend on tracking all of it. So instead of getting caught in what might be said or how you might be perceived, it becomes more grounding to focus on what is actually real in your direct experience, your choices, your growth, your direction. If this message connected with you on some level, take a moment to reflect on one simple question. Where in your life are you still giving too much weight to interpretation, instead of focusing on what you know is true for yourself? And if you feel like sharing your thoughts, not for validation but for reflection, the space below is open. Sometimes just putting your perspective into words helps you understand your own journey a little more clearly.